All right, there you are getting this because my son is sick. So here's what I have for you. Roosevelt, the conservationist. Remember we talked about Roosevelt has the 3 C's: caring for the consumer, busting corporations, and then the conservationist. This is arguably his biggest, most lasting achievement. He worked to preserve the nation's shrinking forests. He set aside 125 million acres in federal reserves, earmarked millions of acres of coal deposits and water resources useful for irrigation and power. This is why we have national parks, is because he set them up for us. Other contributions of Roosevelt, he greatly enlarged the power and the prestige of the president. Remember, we talked about how it didn't matter if it wasn't in the Constitution. He tried it anyway. If it didn't tell him he couldn't do it, he just did it. Unless it told him specifically in the Constitution he couldn't. So he enlarged the power of the presidency. He helped shape progressive movements and later liberal reform because he was a progressive. He opened the eyes of Americans to the fact that they shared a world with other nations and they needed to accept the responsibilities of great power. They didn't necessarily always do that well, but the country realized that we needed to do something with other countries. They were there and we needed to be involved. Roosevelt could have been reelected. Remember, he was not elected the first time. He became the president because McKinley died. So he did serve almost 8 full years, and the precedent was you step down after that. And so he decided to go ahead and step down, but he chose his own predecessor, and he chose William Henry Taft. He was Roosevelt's Secretary of War. He was a mild progressive, and Roosevelt believed that Taft would carry out his responsibilities. Taft often served when Roosevelt was away. In the campaign of 1908, Taft and Bryan both tried. Bryan again is running for president on the Democratic side, and they both tried to claim a little bit that they were progressives like Teddy Roosevelt was. That mantle word there means character. The majority chose stability with Roosevelt because with Roosevelt endorsed Taft, who pulled 321 electoral votes to 162 for Bryan. Bryan loses for the 3rd time. Some interesting, fun things maybe about Taft. He was our largest president. He was well over 300 pounds. That's why his picture shows more of his body instead of just his face. He did once get stuck in a bathtub. The other thing that I think is funny about him is he is the reason we have the 7th inning stretch at a baseball game. So all of you baseball people, that's why. There were no commercials. There wasn't anything going on at baseball games. And so people just sat and watched the game till it was over. Well, one time, Taft, because he was so large, decided he needed to stand. And he stood in the middle of the 7th inning. And because the President of the United States stands, everyone else in the stands also stands. And it became known as the 7th inning stretch, because he needed to stand up and stretch his legs. Taft was known as a trust buster, and so this is my picture of a mallet hitting the monopolies because that's what he did. Supposedly, Roosevelt was, but remember, Roosevelt thought there were some good trusts and some bad trusts. Taft didn't think so. Taft believed that monopolies were bad, period. He brought 90 suits against trusts during his 4 years, and Roosevelt had only brought 44 suits against trusts in 7.5 years. In 1911, Taft ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil Company, and it was judged to be a combination and restraint of trade in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Roosevelt was super angry about that. There's those very good collegiate words again. He was angry about that because Roosevelt was the one who had encouraged the merger to begin with. And so he was angry at Taft and decided he was going to run against him for president. Taft was also known for his dollar diplomacy. And what that means is instead of sending troops into other countries, he sent money into other countries. And so it put the United States dollar into the Far East countries, and he hoped that helping them with money would keep Germany out. And so we can already see that Germany is causing us some trouble. But he's hoping that instead of sending troops, he'll send money. And so that's what he is known for, is his dollar diplomacy. Again, Roosevelt decides he is going to run again. Usually when you have 2 people that are the same running and you have a 3rd person running, what happens? The first 2 split the vote, and the third one wins. And so the Democrats were thrilled that the Republicans were split because Taft got the nod from the Republicans, so Roosevelt decided he was going to create his own party, and he called it the Bull Moose Party. He was a progressive. The Democrats assumed that they were going to win in 1912 as long as they picked a reformer, because the other two would split the vote. Governor Woodrow Wilson seemed to be a good fit. Woodrow Wilson was a scholar. He was a teacher. He became a reformist president of Princeton University in 1902. So he was involved in education. He was elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, and he campaigned against predatory trusts, and so people liked him. Teddy Roosevelt actually campaigned, and at the bottom there it says election of 1912 offered voters a choice not merely of policies but of political and economic philosophies. Roosevelt actually campaigned that he wanted women's suffrage. He campaigned for a minimum wage, health care. This is very much FDR New Deal stuff that isn't going to come around until the late 30s. And so this was something new that people weren't used to. He was way ahead of his time, and he and FDR are related distantly, but they are related. And so he kind of comes up with some of these New Deal reform ideas before FDR does. Wilson, who is a Democrat, which this is kind of funny, he shunned social welfare as a Democrat. He favored small enterprise and competition. And remember, we talked about how that eventually changes. This is the map of the election, and you can see Wilson wins a lot of states. But look closely here at the popular vote. Wilson only wins 42% of the popular vote because these two split. If there were only one Republican running, they would have Taft and or Roosevelt would have won easily because they had more of the popular vote. But because it's split, Wilson ends up with the majority. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving. That's why I keep re-saying what I'm pointing at. But you can see that it is blue all over the place, and that is Wilson. The Bull Moose campaign of 1912, Wilson wins. I just showed you that map. Taft himself had a fruitful old age. Taft is our only president so far that becomes president of the United States and then goes back into government for his job after he is president. First he leaves and he teaches 8 years at Yale University, but then he becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he is actually more well known in our country for being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He had much more of an effect on our country that way. Socialist candidate worth noting, Eugene Ebbs rolled up 900,000 votes, which is 6% of the total cast. And also worth noting, a Democrat hadn't won in over 15 years when Wilson is elected president. You can also see this little cartoon here. This is Roosevelt giving Taft the presidency, and then the next screen is him with a gun to his face saying, "Give it back to me now." We talked about Roosevelt being a cartoonist delight. Yeah, Taft really was because of his stature. All right, I need you to, when you are finished with this, you need to walk up and grab your progressive quiz off my desk. When you're done with the quiz, turn it back in and then go to the next video.